Hi, everybody. One of the standards that, or several of the standards that this course meets involves not just comprehension, but understanding what are called in the standards reader factors in comprehension. And in thinking about how to cover this, because although your book kind of talks about it, it doesn't necessarily explicitly in one section that I could find. I may have overlooked it. Was reminded of a transactional view or theory of reading that has been very influential and that I think really goes with what the standards are trying to get at. So that's what I want to talk about today. This transactional view or transactional theory of reading was developed by Louise Rosenblatt in the 1970s, especially. Now, Rosenblatt herself was influenced by progressives, and when I looked this up last night, I now have spaced if that progressive was John Dewey or if it was Jean Piaget. Um, I think it was Dewey, but I might be mistaken. It might have been Piaget, or it may have been both. Um, and this view of reading was different from the sort of traditional view. And traditionally, the view of reading is that a text has one message, and it's the reader's job to get that message from the text. What Rosenblatt argued is that reading is more complex than that, and it's not just about the reader trying to guess what the author meant. That reading is essentially interactive. It's a transaction, a three-way interaction between the reader, the writer, or the author, and the text. Now, this interaction is all set in a context that includes social factors, cultural factors, historical factors, and probably other contextual factors that I'm forgetting. And so the idea here is that different readers might get different meanings from a text, and that's okay. The meanings that we get are determined by factors that we have within us. Now, some very simple texts clearly have just one meaning. But the type of more complicated texts, including in textbooks in our content areas, often might get different. Um, we might draw different main ideas from it. We might draw different things that we just focus in on. And so the reader factors that relate to this idea are predominantly these five, and I stole these from another textbook. Um, they are, first of all, background knowledge. Let me rephrase that. I just realized it's really these six. So, background knowledge, but also the student's interests. These are things that were talked a little bit about in chapter 6 of your book. Let me turn closed captions on and do that again. So, background knowledge and also interests. Background, these are both talked about in chapter 6 of your book. So, what is the student's background that relates to the reading? So, you might be doing a reading assignment in your physics class. And it's not just your student's background in physics, but it's if the reading shows like an example of physics in everyday life. Has your student actually had that everyday life experience? So it's the background knowledge that is directly related, but it's also the indirect background knowledge that helps us understand something. And again, it's also student interests. It is the student's vocabulary. You can't understand something if you don't know what the words in it mean. It is also the reading strategies and the reading skills that your student has. And there is a difference between a strategy and a skill. Um, it's something that the text I use for 3208 and 5208 developmental reading in the middle school um, goes into a little bit. I think that difference doesn't really matter. I don't think it's a useful distinction for us to make necessarily as teachers. Maybe I just don't truly understand the distinction yet. That's my lack of background knowledge. But the reading strategies and skills. So we have talked about some reading strategies related to background knowledge in chapter 6, but we're going to talk about many more in chapter 7, as well as in some extra strategies next week. So we can think of these things just as sort of the same idea. So Sort of broadly, you might think of a skill as like being able to identify cause and effect in a piece of reading. Cause and effect is important in many of our content areas. So that's a skill, being able to find cause and effect, being able to find the main idea of something. A strategy is something that helps you do that or that helps you understand the reading. Um, Other reader factors are the motivation to read and their ongoing engagement while they are reading. So, sometimes a student might be really highly motivated to read, but then something happens that alters that student's engagement while the reading act is supposed to be taking place. So all of these are reader factors. All of these affect comprehension. Comprehension is also affected by text factors. And a few of the text factors include things like what is the genre of text? So in fiction with genre, we talk about genre like is it a mystery? Is it science fiction? Is it romance? Is it fantasy? Is it horror? Is it a thriller or whatever? Or whatever? Is it a comic novel? We could also talk about genre in terms of is it expository text or is it persuasive text? Is it trying to explain something or is it trying to persuade someone of something? Um, and that relates to text structures. Different text types are structured in different ways. So if you see something that is, for example, comparing and contrasting two countries in a geography class, we are going to compare and contrast in this article Nicaragua and Panama. And so there's a particular text structure that relates to compare and contrast. You might, go point by point of the big, five categories you're comparing and contrasting, or you might first discuss Nicaragua and then discuss Panama and then um, describe similarities and differences. But there's key text structures for different purposes of writing. And there are different text features. Text features include things in textbooks like tables of contents, like indexes. It also includes things like what pictures, what visuals are there. So that might be a map in a social studies book. It might be a diagram in a science book. It might be a diagram in a health book. It might be um, a step-by-step flow chart in a math book of how to address a certain type of problem. So different text features, these include things like tables of contents and indexes that are commonly found in textbooks. But beyond that, it includes supplementary materials like images, visuals, as well as the captions that go with those visuals. It also includes things like headings and subheadings. Might include the use of color. So in some textbooks, for example, headings and headers are in a separate color. Um, this could also include text features in digital text, which includes things like hyperlinks, which requires a little bit of different reading skills than a print textbook. And then writer factors. And these aren't particularly important for us in this course, but they can be useful in some cases for you to help readers understand text a little bit more by talking about its author a little bit. This is probably most true when you're reading old texts, which is often going to be an English class, but it might also be in a history class when you're reading primary sources. And so these are things like what is the writer's purpose for writing? Why did they write this work? What is their vocabulary? And that includes the fact that vocabulary does change over time. Some words mean something different today than they meant 100 years ago, or certainly 400 years ago. Um, an example is the word awful. Today, the word awful means bad, negative, right? Something is awful, like it was an awful game because my team lost. But awful used to mean literally full of awe. And that had a very different meaning. So vocabulary does change, but it's also the specialized vocabulary that the writer might use. And then the writer's own background. And again, sometimes that's important, sometimes it isn't, but these are factors that can affect comprehension. And so in terms of the standard for Minnesota that I want you to walk away from this presentation knowing, A student's comprehension, and in fact, our comprehension as adult readers, comes from a combination of the interactions of these things. It comes from what the standard refers to as print processing abilities. Um, this is essentially the ability to identify words. So, your use of phonics to sound out unfamiliar words, as well as your word identification skills, just sort of in general. That is part of comprehension. Your motivation, your interests, your background knowledge, as we've talked about, those are all parts of comprehension. Those all affect how easily, how readily we comprehend a text. So does a reader's cognitive abilities. Um, if a person has strong motivation and has a lot of interest, but and has strong background knowledge, but they have cognitive delays or they have cognitive disabilities, that will likely negatively affect their comprehension. If cognitively they are advanced, if they are academically gifted, that will, positively typically affect their comprehension. But cognitive ability plays a role. It doesn't play the only role. A student's knowledge of how people talk and write academically, and I said academic language here because it's a friendlier word. The standard says academic discourse, but that's academic language. It's how in your content field is print material typically presented. And then, as I mentioned earlier, text type, is it print or is it digital? This is an ongoing area of research, and this is especially concerning in elementary school for many teachers, which, this is not an elementary class, but I think it applies in high school as well, in that we're starting to realize that the brain processes text differently depending on whether it's print or digital, and that has some potential ramifications. There is some research that indicates that students, and it's all students. It's not just students that aren't used to digital text. That students have better comprehension and better retention of the information when they read a print text rather than a digital text. And that's something I would suggest for if you have a student who is struggling with reading. One thing to think about is if that student is using digital texts, maybe that student's accommodation needs to be that they use print texts, because again, the research seems to be um, pretty clear that our comprehension is higher with print than with digital. And many of you might be asking, especially those of you in the schools, but those of you in this course as well. They say, well, why are there ebooks for all of our courses? I'll editorialize here and I'll say there are ebooks because textbook publishers are incredibly greedy and they want ebooks rather than print books because you aren't going to sell a ebook. You aren't going to sell it back at the end of the semester. You aren't going to loan it to a friend who's taking the course the next semester. You can't. And so the whole reason that publishers like ebooks and that they are pushing ebooks so much is strictly an economic reason. They won't admit that. They will say, "Oh no, no, we have all these wonderful study tools with our ebooks," and those study tools can be helpful. Don't get me wrong. The whole reason I used my lab this semester is because I used it as in math as a math student when I was getting my math degree back in 2018, and as a math student, the interaction with math problems in the homework set in my lab for math is was very, very helpful in the courses that it was well developed in. It's not well developed in this course, and I apologize. I when I looked at it, I thought it was better than it really is. But although those extra tools can be helpful, I don't think they make up for the lack of having a print textbook. It seems really clear to me that print is better. And that's clear in the schools as well, I think. And I hope you advocate for print. And again, that's editorial. You don't have to agree with me about that. But the research kind of agrees with me. Um, so that's our transactional view of reading. Reading is a transaction. It's an interactive approach between the reader, between the author, between the text. All of that is set in a cultural, social, historical context. Um, and readers bring their own backgrounds and factors to the reading process, and that includes this list of factors. Um, from their ability to identify words through their ability to navigate different types of texts. If you have any questions, please let me know, and thank you so much for watching.